Hi, and welcome back to Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, cities, architecture, and other things related to design and urban spaces and places. And today, again, in a very similar manner as the last time, we'll discuss about the role of play, playfulness, and playgrounds in our cities. And we'll discuss why should Europe actually invest more into playgrounds. Europe nowadays is facing a lot of challenges, including war, including climate, but also growing crisis of trust. And playgrounds might be the solution as something that might be overlooked, but my guest advocates that this should be treated as a critical infrastructure because a playground, a simple playground, can be an answer to stronger communities, better climate resilience, and also Europe being more competitive. And my guest today is Johanna Fabrin, who's the managing director of 21st Europe, which is a think tank, and also former strategist at IKEA's innovation lab, Space 10. Johanna's work looks far beyond the slide of the swing set. She's asking how play shapes social ties, how it builds the skills that our children need in the AI-driven future, and how can it help Europe craft a new, more optimistic outlook for the next 25 years. So actually, and surprisingly, this is conversation not only about playgrounds, but this is conversation about public space, trust, resilience, fighting for better future, for more competitive Europe, and how can play be integrated in all of that, and how can play be something more strategic than we think. Let's dive into playgrounds. Johanna, welcome to Urbcast. Hi.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about all things related to Europe, and not only. We'll talk about play. We will talk about, I hope as well, your journey and ambition with this exciting project. First of all, let's start with a short introduction. Could you introduce yourself briefly? Share something else about your background as well to the listeners.
I'm Johanna, and I'm the managing director of a new think tank called 21st Europe, based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And my background is a mix of economics and climate policy. And then before we launched 21st Europe, been much more involved in strategy from a design perspective while living here in Denmark the last 7 years.
One of those was Space 10, which was the school design hub here in Copenhagen. Could you also share a bit more about that to the listeners who haven't had a chance to visit?
Yeah, Space 10 was an external innovation lab for IKEA that lasted for about 10 years and ended up shutting down about 2 years ago. And was based on this idea of how to think about the future and the role that design could play in transforming IKEA within a 5 to 10 year time horizon. So we worked on all sorts of things from solar energy to food sustainability to urban housing, a project with effect called Urban Village, for example. And so we spanned quite a few topics when it came to the sort of innovation and design efforts at Space 10.
So now you still continue the work with innovation and design. This is still somehow interrelated, but from what I understand, you do it in a more independent way. 21st Europe is a very small organization, quite independent, and also fresh. What are you up to now?
Yeah, we started working on the idea exactly a year ago and then launched officially here the 1st of January of 2025. And the idea behind 21st Europe was that we really saw while working at Space 10 that we had a methodology or an approach that was really effective in engaging people. And by that approach, I mean taking very complex ideas and using design to visualize, make them tangible, make them really simple, and use that as a way to test some of these ideas in public. So by making something visual and really design-led and then sharing it at quite an early stage, you also get immediate feedback. You get really high engagement from diverse stakeholders. And so it was an approach that we saw was quite effective in bringing the right people to the table, bringing smarter people to the table than us. And that was the thinking behind 21st Europe, that we wanted to use those tools that we had developed at Space 10, but use them in a context that we felt was much more meaningful to us. And by us, I mean myself, and then the partner and founder, Kovapur, who was the CEO at Space 10 at the time.
Yeah, I think that what I liked at Space 10 is that whenever you would just walk next to it, it was based in a meatpacking district in Copenhagen. And whenever you would just walk past, it was just very interesting to peek and see what's in there, because it was like a place, like a platform also for art and so on. And this is one of the ways you can start the design dialogue. But here for this discussion and also moving forward from Space 10, we will focus on playgrounds and also the way that playgrounds are influencing Europe, are influencing well-being, are influencing the quality of life. But why playgrounds? I mean, I already mentioned some of the basic assumptions and advantages, but why did you focus on the playground in the first place?
That's a great question. And maybe I should rewind a bit and start with sort of not just the methodology of 21st Europe, but the thinking behind it. So using design as a primary tool in terms of testing new ideas and thinking about the future. But in the context of 21st Europe, that scope of the future that we're really thinking about is Europe over the next 75 years. So how do we build a story, a narrative, a vision for how Europe can be much more ambitious, optimistic, and inclusive? And in that sense, playgrounds as one of what we call our blueprints, or sort of, pictures of this future vision of Europe, was quite an intuitive choice for both Kove and I, who both have small children and spend a lot of our time at playgrounds. So something that fills a bit of our mental space. But we also see in the news that and sort of feel this energy or sort of cultural shift that's really focused on, in the context of Europe, defense, security, investing more of our European budgets in local weapons manufacturing and production. And while the security of Europe is, of course, extremely important, we felt that it was almost becoming at the expense of investing in the types of infrastructure and benefit and well-being that makes Europe worth defending. And so in that sense, playgrounds were our way of kind of, questioning that focus around weapons and security, to say, there's so much else that makes Europe strong than besides its physical security that we really need to remember to hold on to. And playgrounds are this fantastic symbol, both from a design perspective, but also from a society perspective, in terms of investing in our public spaces, investing in our communities, investing in future generations. And that was kind of the thinking behind playgrounds at a high level, is how do we make sure that in this discussion of uncertainty in Europe, that we're still thinking about the future and really recognizing what is it that values to us as Europeans.
I think that's a very big topic, discussing Europe and discussing the direction of Europe. And this is definitely something that I'm also looking at. We've just released this report, The Copenhagen Way, some time ago, and this is definitely something I also wanted to mention here in this discussion, because we also looked at the city level, specifically at Copenhagen, and the transformation of Copenhagen and the lessons that can be implemented in other European cities. But it's not to say that Copenhagen is superior. There are many European cities that are doing an amazing job. And I think that this is something that we might forget when we talk about Europe in this big global context. There is a lot of talk about, Europe is lagging. We are not as good as the US or China in terms of manufacturing and so on. But actually, let's be honest, Europe has extremely, extremely high quality of life. It is, and it has been for so many decades, the safe haven for many, many different things, for investing your money, but also for the public life. So maybe let's explore that thread further. And I'm just curious to hear your opinion on how is Europe, how are European cities doing in your opinion? Not only on the level of the playgrounds, but overall in building good quality life.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned too the point or the argument that Europe is lagging compared to China and the US. And I think that's in part why Europe has been quote unquote lagging, is that we've been defining our success relative to hardware manufacturing in China and software dominance in the US. And I think what Europe needs to do is sort of reset that idea of what defines our success, both from a moral compass standpoint, but also from an economic edge standpoint on the global stage, and to really recognize what is it that Europe's strengths are that are not relative to the US and China, but what makes Europe distinctly strong. And I think one of the elements that Europe does, besides actually having very strong industries within physical manufacturing and blooming industries within software, is really thinking about its citizen from a holistic perspective. And I think that's something where, when we're thinking about well-being, quality of life, that Europe has been able to maintain such high standards across those parameters while still being quite economically strong. So thinking about that dynamic and that balance from a much longer term perspective, I think is something that Europe needs to leverage in its own storytelling, especially when it comes to not only attracting international talent to move to Europe, but all of the innovators and entrepreneurs who want to see some crazy solutions come to life, that they also see that it's Europe that they want to stay and invest in. And I think as someone who's lived, all around the world, I think one of the privileges of living in Europe is, as someone who's also pregnant with my fourth kid, I would never be able to afford to have 4 kids anywhere else in the world, while at the same time having a career that I love, with meeting super interesting people. And I think it's this space of offering all of these elements to a person's life that is what Europe can do that almost nowhere else in the world can.
How is that being institutionalized in terms of play? Because your project is called the Continent of Play, meaning specifically Europe. So I guess that the idea here is that cities should invest more in playgrounds, in the spaces for play. If that's the case, how should they do it? Because, to be honest, is play that high in the hierarchy of needs? When you are like a city governor, you're a mayor or someone, and you look in your budget, why should I be incentivized to put play higher up when I need to cover, the mobility, the buses, the, healthcare and all of that?
That's a great question. And it's a little bit pointing at our provocation with this, in that we should be thinking about investing in play and playgrounds as part of our critical infrastructure, just like we invest in energy infrastructure or mobility infrastructure. And there's many different angles to it, but there's 3 that I'll highlight here. One piece is that, from the perspective of increasing sentiments of nationalism, of division, of exclusion across Europe, that playgrounds are one of the last public spaces that have not been commercialized. They're one of the last spaces where you meet people from your community. It's not totally awkward to speak with strangers. You have that interaction with...
Maybe one of very few places actually in Denmark when it's not that odd to talk to
Exactly.
strangers.
I mean, here in Denmark, where it's super weird to speak to strangers, there's something natural to, ask some other mom or dad on the playground about their kid and have that interaction. So there's something just from a societal and inclusivity perspective that playgrounds are this public space that, again, are one of the few surviving public spaces that haven't become entirely commercialized. So that's one element. Another element is where Copenhagen specifically, and Denmark more broadly, really has been super successful in, every time that it's investing in playgrounds, it's also investing in climate resilient infrastructure. So thinking about how, during increasingly frequent heat waves, you're building these public spaces where, the temperature is measurably lower, in terms of creating green spaces and shading, especially for children who are more sensitive to heat waves. Same thing with flooding. A lot of the playgrounds here in Copenhagen are double as flood reservoirs. We're just sitting down the street from a playground near Inghave Place, where there's a basketball court that's sunken into the ground so that it can suck up a lot of excess flood water. So there's a huge piece in terms of thinking about how you build new public spaces with intention that can be multifunctional, that playgrounds lend themselves quite intuitively to. And then the third piece is when we think about our future generations and what will be required for competitiveness when it comes to talent. In the current thinking around AI becoming a general purpose technology and quite dominant, the natural sort of next thought is that all of our work will be automated. A lot of the more mechanized tasks will go to robots or AI agents or whatnot. So then what is the key competency that our children and their children will need to compete on the global stage when it comes to talent? And a lot of those skills are really critical social skills that are developed on playgrounds. So if a playground is designed pedagogically sort of correct, playgrounds are really strong in promoting creativity, promoting risk assessment, social skills in terms of speaking with strangers, also social skills in terms of negotiation. So whose turn is it to take the slide? And these are some of the skills that will be quite distinct in a future labor market in terms of who succeeds and who doesn't succeed are those that are strongest along these social parameters, particularly when it comes to creativity and creative thinking. So in that sense, playgrounds are not just an investment for families, but they're an investment in public space and your communities, in assimilation of an increasing immigrant population especially. They're an investment in climate resilience, and they're also an investment in our future labor market. So from that standpoint, then it starts to feel less frivolous, like it might on its face value, and becomes a much stronger argument, in my opinion, in terms of why this is something that should be prioritized across Europe.
So we are talking here about something which is way, way more, in a way, complex than just a playground airport. So it's not just a slide. We are talking here about more of a community hub, in a sense. And I think that I do agree with the point that it brings people closer. I experienced several times when, there would be a kid from like international kid and joining the playground here in Copenhagen, for example, and somehow, despite the language barrier, like the children, they would just play.
They figured it out.
Like there's some sort of this international kind of language of play, I would say, which makes it possible to connect. How does play and playgrounds tie to this culture of trust and sharing space? Because this is something that I would say Europe is great at, and especially Copenhagen. I feel and Denmark. I feel like people are very aware of what does it mean to share the space and have the shared responsibility for space as well. So yeah, even more on the trust and play and how does the play fit into the European context of trust?
I would say that a lot of the fear that we have of other people, whether it's fear of immigrants or fear of other people who don't speak our language or come from different backgrounds, whatever it might be, comes from simply not knowing them, not knowing anyone from whatever country or who speaks French instead of Danish or looks different, whatever it might be. And I think having the space that you have at playgrounds, exactly as you said before, in terms of especially children are the best in not really being affected by the biases that the rest of us become ingrained with over time, of having these spaces where you start to get to know and meet people from different backgrounds. And I think a lot of society today is quite organized around our social circles being related to work, school, and then one of the fantastic opportunities is our kids, because we as adults, we don't get to inject our biases in the same way in choosing who our kids hang out with. And that becomes, who we start to interact with is our kids' friends' parents. There's something in terms of how do we leverage that really open mindset that children have in terms of interacting with people, where, just as you said before, a language barrier is not a barrier to social interaction, to developing a friendship or relationship in the same way that it is for adults. And so how do we think about play and playgrounds and investing in public spaces as a way to get to know people who we wouldn't otherwise get to know? And I think that's a very important prerequisite to developing trust. And I'm also not suggesting that you'll meet everyone, every different type of person on the playground, from around the world, but just having that muscle trained in terms of consistently interacting with people that you wouldn't otherwise yourself maybe choose to interact with or be in a situation to interact with, and strengthening that muscle or that idea that just because I don't understand or know anyone doesn't mean that they're also not a person who just wants the best for their family, that wants really strong opportunities in the labor market, that want to live in nice areas and nice housing, that a lot of these sort of basic things that we want for ourselves are also things that everyone else wants across Europe. That's a huge piece in developing trust. And that's also a whole other conversation of trust as its own type of societal infrastructure that's really important.
Definitely, I think that the trust is something that distinguishes European cities from the other cities in around the world, and that was something that also was one of the key results for in the Copenhagen Way report, where we realized that this trust between private and public, with being open and sharing the vision with the citizens, like this is something. This mutual trust allowed the transformation and turning Copenhagen into the place that it is right now. So it wasn't only luck; it was this intention of like trusting each other. And I think this is very important. But obviously, we are in the times of a crisis, and I mean here many different things. I mean here the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis. You can look at the UK, like terrible things are happening there. There's a huge tension, and also in other European countries as well. We have war happening in Europe. So, what and how? What role can play and design have in the times of crisis?
I love that question. I think there's a couple different answers to it. From a very sort of practical standpoint, when we're in crisis, as whether it's as an individual family, a neighborhood, a society, this is something that children pick up on. You don't need to tell them, they know. And there's something about keeping that curiosity, that spark of childhood alive that allows for more resilient children in the future. I think that's particularly important for the children of Ukraine, that they still have these moments of lightness, and what it feels like to be a child will be very important for who they become as future adults and what that means on the Ukrainian economy. So in that sense, play has a very specific therapeutic function in times of crisis. I think from a more macro perspective in terms of the importance of play in times of crisis is being able to see beyond the crisis of the moment. The war in Ukraine, the trade war from the US, the recent, question mark of drones flying over various European airports and cyber attacks. We will continue to see these crises over the coming decades. And having that ability to think long term, to think optimistically, to think about including people and also ambitiously, and thinking about play in many ways is one of those long-term investments that is inherently positive and optimistic. I think that is a type of resilience at a societal level that will take Europeans through the next several decades to come. That's extremely important in being able to sort of step out of the crisis of the moment and think about and even dream about how we can make things better. And there's a fantastic quote that I can't even remember who it's from, but it goes along the lines of if we don't believe that we can make the future better, then we won't step up and take responsibility for making it so. And play is just one aspect of that, but thinking about how we can make things better, more enjoyable, more fun, and not just for children, but also for ourselves as adults, will be a key tool of resiliency when it comes to this period of insecurity and crisis.
A couple of episodes ago, I was talking to Michael Colville-Anderson. He's a popular urbanist. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a Canadian-Danish urbanist, and he was living in Kiev for some years when he was doing different urban prototyping projects. And and basically tactical urbanism. So he was engaging a lot of people living there, and he was saying about the resiliency crisis in a way, because like people are resilient, but they are like, I mean, here people living in Ukraine, people at war, they are resilient still, but they are tired of being resilient. They are very tired of being, for more than 3 years now, being very resilient, waking up every day and still having to be resilient to your family, to your kids, and so on. At the same time, people do want to engage. Like the urbanist I was interviewing, he was organizing groups of people. It's called in Ukrainian toloka, where basically people come and help you, like pro bono, because next time you can help them. And this is about this kind of communal spirit. So going forward and thinking about, longer perspective, how do you think can Europe be or stay competitive, but at the same time keep this resilience, keep the spirit, keep this humane part of it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think maybe I'll go back to sort of your earlier point around trust and thinking about trust as an important element in European society. Because another way of speaking about trust, especially between the private and the public sector and also sort of civil society, is thinking about it as a social contract in terms of what do you expect from your government? What can you depend on from your government or the private sector? Or what can the government depend on from you as a citizen or an individual? And there's been quite a few studies throughout the years that in societies that have a stronger trust-based social contract, that this also has an impact in terms of lubricating sort of the economic condition. So in higher trust societies, it's less, just from a business standpoint, the need to set up a huge contract just to engage in a supplier relationship of supplying goods for whatever purpose it might be isn't required to the same extent that it is in low trust societies. And there's something about that fluidity across an economy that allows for transactions to happen much more quickly, transactions to happen much more frequently, for people being able to or being willing to take greater risks because they trust who they're going into business with, that allows for growth in an economy. And so I think that's an extremely important piece in terms of, and also an undervalued piece of, we think of trust and this social contract as a social good, as related specifically to well-being of citizens, but it's also quite an economic factor and strength that should be leveraged much more in terms of it being easier to engage in business here in Europe, also as an outside company, because you can trust when the government says that these are the rules and regulations, and if you comply, then you'll be fine. And I think in Europe, we also forget that that's not the case in a lot of the world. So I think that, from a purely sort of economic perspective, that there is a competitive edge that's hiding there within Europe that isn't really leveraged to the extent that it could be. And then all of the other things that we've kind of touched upon, of the competitiveness of being able to offer people a nice place to live, not making life too hard on people, and actually trying to help them, enjoy amazing urban landscapes, social activities, time with their children, time with their parents, whatever it might be.
Here you emphasize the role of the social contract. I would also say, as I understood, the role of public. I think that often in neoliberal economies, especially in the US, the role of the public, the role of the governing body would be decreased, because you would just leave everything up to the open market, because it will take care of everything. The answer is that it will not. Like, there are some of the things that have to be taken care of collectively. And here I think that what I read from what we've been discussing so far, the trust and the resilience, isn't that the time that we stop measuring the prosperity of countries only through GDP. Like, I mean, there are so many other measures. We've discussed some of those. What's your take on that?
It's such a tough one, because it's, do you try and win by playing by the rules of the game that you're in? or do you try and destroy the game and make your own game? And I'll admit that I personally go a little bit back and forth on this. I think people have a tendency, and I don't think that AI and big data have necessarily helped, that there's something quite objective that feels around numbers, especially one number. It's super easy to compare black and white. How we move away from that need as people to have something really simplified, I think will be a challenge, but is also part of our provocation at 21st Europe of how we tell a different story that moves people, that is in many ways as simple as a number like GDP, but is much more emotional and feels real in terms of, if I tell you the story about the future of Europe and then tell you a different story about the future of China or the future of US, I think that's a much more compelling and human way to talk about well-being in the future that we want to work towards. And I would also bet that the future of Europe that at least we want to tell at 21st Europe would be much more inspiring and exciting than to say, well, the American GDP is going to increase by 10% over the next X amount of years. And so in that sense, GDP is a powerful way to measure growth, but growth is very much in the context of, it's language from a corporate setting, from a more private sector setting. And I think we want to think about what a better life looks like, how we get to better living conditions, better schools, better environment, more free time for ourselves. And if we can succeed as 21st Europe and tell that story, for example, I think eventually over time, it'll be those stories that are much more motivating than measuring ourselves, comparing number by number how the world is doing.
And obviously, that's a very broad philosophical question, thinking of whether we should measure ourselves and the development of the world in GDP, in money, or something else. But I think that, this is so important that we talk about other things as well. And I feel like, back to the beginning of our discussion, US is great in software, China in manufacturing, but Europe has its own qualities as well. So coming back to the continent of play and 21st Europe, what's the next step for you? So obviously this is a podcast, we can't show the project. We'll add the link to the description of this episode to the continent of play itself. But could you share something more on your ambition for continent of play as a project, as an initiative, and as well 21st Europe?
Yeah, of course. And one of the important aspects of continent of play that we haven't touched on that is quite critical when it comes to things like trust, the social contract, competitiveness of Europe, is also this idea that people understand the value that Europe brings to them, that there is something tangible. So in our proposal or thinking around the continent of play, we had identified a few existing budget areas within the EU Commission that would very comfortably cover this mandate or this scope. And a small percentage, I believe, off the top of my head, we had calculated that 1% of a sub-budget of one of the many infrastructure budgets could cover the development of 100,000 of these playgrounds across Europe. So we're also not just talking about one playground, we're talking about playgrounds everywhere, with the idea of how we make Europe super tangible, that you understand the value that Europe brings to you as a citizen, in the sense that you can physically go to it every day, feel it, touch it, and really understand that. So in that sense, in terms of the future of continent of play, we've had a few discussions also here in Copenhagen around building prototypes and iterating on the physical design of it, testing more sustainable materials. But I think from a long-term perspective, we're really thinking about each of these blueprints at scale. So not just building a single playground, but thinking about how we make these investments priorities within existing EU budgets today and how we activate those, and also make playgrounds not just something that each individual country needs to find the funds for, but becomes a democratically accessible part of being Europe, is access to this type of infrastructure. So that's in terms of continent of play specifically.
That would be a very novel approach. I can imagine European Union saying like, okay, from now on, you need to build the playgrounds. And that would be such a fun experiment to see like people reacting, because obviously still as one continent, we are different countries and different approaches, right? So I would love to see the physical form and shape of those playgrounds, because for example, in Poland, we have this, I think it's less and less now, but we had unfortunately this tendency to put a fence around our playgrounds, to make them safer, whereas it's not the case in Denmark.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think about the design of playgrounds themselves, very much to the point of our playgrounds for keeping our kids locked up or our playgrounds for opening up to our community. So beyond continent of play specifically, we're also working on our next blueprint right now, Made in Europe, and all of our blueprints really cover a lot of these similar macro themes in terms of visualizing ways, whether they already exist to a certain extent today or are totally new ideas around how Europe adds value to people, to make people believe in this idea that we are stronger together as a continent. So we're looking into thinking more about how particularly European manufacturing and digital services, that a lot of the high standards we have in Europe from a regulatory perspective that some people perceive as a hindrance on the private sector is actually quite a competitive angle, from a consumer perspective in terms of transparency around making sure that, in Europe, we know our food doesn't have arsenic in, which is not the same of everywhere. And so these themes are themes that we'll continue to explore from different angles, sometimes more quote unquote frivolous on face value, something like playgrounds that's really easy to talk about, and sometimes much more complicated issues and systems like the regulatory schemes around compliance and certification, which is what we'll be looking into next.
There is this big wave of deregulating almost everything nowadays. In Poland, for example, there was even a task force that was tasked with creating less regulation and proposing what can we basically, just stop doing, and which legislation is actually obsolete and shouldn't be used. And this is like such a double-edged sword, because we need the regulation as well. And the regulation is something that makes Europe credible, but also predictable. And that's something that investors from overseas like as well. So talking about further inspiration, about Europe, ideally also your work, I would love to ask you for a recommendation. If you could share a book or report or something similar that could inspire people further, something uplifting, ideally.
Something uplifting. Right now I'm reading a book called Citizens, and I'll have to get back to you on the author. But I think in a time too where a lot of people feel disenfranchised, disconnected from being able to do anything, that this book has a really interesting take and argument for why individuals still have so much agency and influence in their local communities, but also at a larger scale. So I'm not finished with it yet, but it's extremely inspiring also just for my own work at 21st Europe to think about how a lot of some of the examples that are mentioned of big change makers that we think about, whether it's Gandhi, whether it's Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, a lot of these individuals started out by just asking their friends, their family, what can we do? And then these individuals drove global movements. They didn't start by going to the government and saying, hey, we need to change this policy or, these rules around inclusivity and discrimination. They started small, and when you have ideas and when you have stories that resonate with people, they travel fast. So I would highly recommend the book Citizens, author name coming at some point. TBD. In terms of just reminding people that there's a lot of agency that you have as an individual in terms of being able to just dream and want a better future and start manifesting that to a certain extent.
We'll have the author of the book by the time this is published, so no worries about that. But that's great. That's a great recommendation. I would love to add one more. There's a similar situation. I haven't been through the book yet, but I think there is like this very exciting book called Super Europe by, I think he's called Arturo Briz. I also need to come back
with
on
the
that.
author, yeah.
But it is saying a lot about the power that Europe still has, and I think that it reflects our discussion that Europe still is extremely competitive and such a powerful place as a continent here. And I think that we should cherish our values and how we design, our daily life, our physical spaces as well, and especially the playground. So this is a call for more playgrounds in Europe.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for joining me in Herbcast. And I feel like, yeah, that was extremely fascinating discussion to me. I feel like we could talk even more, but that's the format. So hopefully see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the newest episode of Herbcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to read more about the 21st Europe idea and the concept for playgrounds, feel free to look at the episode's description, where you will find the links to read or learn more. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you soon. And remember, play, playfulness, playgrounds are very important.